Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you, as well as our good friends from C-SPAN, to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and Public Programs Producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. I'd just like to thank all of you for coming out today after the big snow we had yesterday. So I hope you didn't get cabin fever or anything like that. Today's noon author talk, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking by Mark Will Weber, is being presented in conjunction with today's opening of our brand new exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History. Since the first European settlers, Americans have enjoyed a drink. At times, many of us have enjoyed a lot of drinks. But other Americans, fearing the harm alcohol would do to society and to individuals, have tried to stop our drinking or limit who, when, and where we could consume alcohol. These two different views of alcoholic beverages run throughout American history. Sometimes they have existed in relative peace, other times they have been at war. Spirited Republic uses National Archives documents and artifacts to show how government programs and policies changed over time and to illustrate the wide variety of views about alcohol held by Americans. The stories they tell echo today's debate over regulating drinking and the legalization of other drugs. The exhibit will be open until January 10th, 2016, and is located in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery on the main exhibit level. Over the course of the next 10 months, while the exhibit is open, the National Archives will present a series of author talks, panel discussions, films, and even wine and whiskey tastings. To find out more about these and the exhibit, please take one of our monthly event calendars from the racks in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today, as I mentioned earlier, is Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking by Mark Will Weber. Mark Will Weber is a seasoned journalist and magazine editor, as well as an aficionado of both military and presidential history. Mark has published a noted historical feature on the Battle of Antietam, and is the great-grandson of Civil War General J.K. Robeson, who led the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry during the campaign leading up to Lee's surrender. His grandfather, Colonel Charles Isaiah Fadis, served in 3 wars: Mexican Border War, World War I and World War II, and served as a United States Congressman from 1933 to 1942. A former senior editor at Runner's World magazine, Mark has an extensive background in journalism and has written for publications including the New York Times, the Boston Phoenix, the Allentown Morning Call, Men's Journal, and Men's Health. Mark is the author of the running trivia book, 1001 Questions from the Springs to the Marathon, Run for the Diamonds, 100 Years of Foot Racing in Berwick, Pennsylvania, and The Quotable Runner. Please join me in welcoming Mark Will Weber to the National Archives.
It's great to be at the National Archives today. Thanks for having me. If you remember what yesterday was like, that's sort of what it was like in 1841 when William Henry Harrison was inaugurated here in the city. And Harrison is probably most famous for the president who served the shortest term, because he died about a month later after he was inaugurated, because he was, the theory being that he was around in that terrible weather and didn't wear a hat. So probably needed a whiskey chaser or two to ward off the cold. But for my research, when I started this book, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking, Harrison is most famous because his campaign had an alcohol slogan to it. He was the log cabin and hard cider campaign. And so they actually used the hard cider during their campaigning. They would make these little cabins at election sites, and his supporters would sit in there and drink hard cider the whole time. So when I think of Harrison, I think of that rather than his very short term. The book itself came about because of a golf book, weirdly enough, and I'm not a golfer, and I actually had not read this book. It's called First Off the Tee. And in that book, they talk a lot about the presidents who golfed, the 13, 14 guys who play that game. including Taft, if you can believe it. He needed somebody to tee the ball up for him. He couldn't bend down and do that himself. However, in that book, they talk about Warren G. Harding, and it's during Prohibition. Nobody's supposed to drink. Nobody's supposed to transport alcohol. And Harding would often go golfing up here at Chevy Chase and other golf courses around the city, and he would habitually stash a fifth of whiskey in his golf bag, and every couple of holes, he would take a shot or two of whiskey. He rarely broke 100, which might explain why. But a friend of mine read that, who is a golfer, and he said, I was fascinated by that. He goes, I want to know what all those guys drank. And he looks at me and says, come on, Mark, you're a writer. Why don't you write this? And I thought, what am I going to do with the guys like Carter and Coolidge that didn't drink? They're going to be boring. So I put it off for about a year, and he kept after me. And finally, just to placate my friend, I said, look, I'm going to do the guys that didn't drink much, and if they're interesting, I'll keep going. And soon after that, I thought, well, Billy Carter drank a lot and embarrassed his brother. So when I began to think in that those terms, I figured out how to handle the 4 or 5 presidents that were very light drinkers. The rest of the guys drank enough that they were interesting on their own without their family members helping them. So that's how it kind of came about. And I'm just going to do a very quick PowerPoint, well, maybe a half hour, and then we can do some Q&A, whatever you want to ask me. I even know stuff about Millard Fillmore, if you want to know about anything about him. So we'll start. Drinking with the Presidents, a very interesting glimpse of our chief executives through the bottom of a glass. This is a cartoon by a D.C. area guide who I really love his stuff, Richard Thompson, and he gave me permission to use it, nice guy. And it shows the two extremes of the presidents. There's Grover Cleveland, whose real name was Stephen, by the way, and one of his nicknames was Big Steve or Uncle Jumbo. And then there's Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge hardly drank at all, very, very little bit. He did occasionally have a beer prior to Prohibition. And Coolidge was not the most exciting president. You know, he was famous for not talking. And he somebody once sat next to him at a dinner party, a woman, and she said to him, I have a bet that I can get you to say more than 3 words. And he looked at her and said, you lose. As I said, not a ball of fire. When he died, Dorothy Parker, the famous writer and humorist who held court at the Algonquin Hotel in New York City, somebody said, Dorothy, did you hear President Coolidge died? And she said, how could they tell? Now, Cleveland, on the other hand, was a fun guy. And when he was a young politician in Buffalo, he was running for some small office against a friend of his. And they both agreed that it wouldn't look good if they were drinking all the time on the campaign trail. So they agreed to limit themselves, this will show you where he was coming from, to 4 beers a day. And after about a week, they both agreed that was way too arduous. There wasn't enough beer. But they didn't want to break their promise of the 4 beers a day. So what they did is they doubled the size of their beer stein. So they went from 16 ounces to like 20 ounces, stayed at the alleged 4 beer limit, and that's what they did. Father of our country, George Washington, and I often get asked, what did Washington drink? And he drank Madeira wine, was one of his favorites. Back in that day, they often fortified their Madeira wine with rum, so it was a pretty potent drink. He loved champagne. One of his favorite drinks was this dark beer from Philadelphia. It was a porter, and an Englishman by the name of Robert Hare brewed it. So when you go through Washington's letters, it's really fun when you stumble on one where he's writing to one of his friends in Philly, and he's saying, if Mr. Hare has made any more of his exquisite porter, could he please send 3 gross to Mount Vernon, because I know there'll be a great need for it. So he loved this dark beer. And the Yards Brewery in Philadelphia, they're a microbrew, actually makes a very good facsimile of that beer. I'm not sponsored by Yards. I wish that I were, but they have a George Washington Tavern Porter, and it's brewed with molasses is part of the formula, and it's very authentic to the recipe of the beer that Washington loved. The other interesting thing about Washington, I think, is that he didn't really drink whiskey, but he manufactured whiskey and sold it, and was, in fact, one of the biggest sellers on the Mount Vernon plantation. And he went into the business a couple years after he put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I don't think that was coincidental, but he put down the Whiskey Rebellion, and then within a couple years, he decides to go into the whiskey business, and they did quite a lively trade. They sold the whiskey off the back of wagons in Old Town Alexandria, just across the river here. And here's he wrote this in a letter to a friend or a relative, I forget. Mr. Anderson has engaged me in a distillery on a small scale and is very desirous of increasing it, assuring me that I shall find my account in it. And by that he meant make money, which he did. And the people at Mount Vernon have reconstructed this distillery, so you can actually go there. It's quite expensive. I think it's like $90 a bottle. And friends of mine that really do know whiskey better than I do claim it's pretty harsh stuff. It's more like moonshine. It's not like top shelf the Wild Turkey or anything. So if you do shell out the $90 for it, just be forewarned. Now, Anderson was one of Washington's guys at Mount Vernon. He was of Scottish ancestry, so he knew how to make this stuff, and he kept pressing Washington to it. At some point, they had 5 different stills cranking out whiskey that he sold. Now, this is, as you can see, Monticello, and Jefferson is often called the father of American wine. That would probably make Ben Franklin the grandfather, since he taught Jefferson a lot about it when they were both diplomats over in France. The interesting thing I think about Jefferson is that he almost went bankrupt because of his, he loved to entertain, and he had to have top shelf wine all the time. He wouldn't settle for the second best, and he entertained so frequently and so lavishly that by the time of his death, Monticello was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and his daughter, in fact, had to sell Monticello not long after Jefferson had died. But when you go through his account books, it's very interesting because he was very meticulous about how much they drank the year before. So he would often say things like, you'd see 423 bottles of champagne, and then he'd cross that out and write 500 for the next year. He didn't want to be caught short. And his correspondence back and forth to Europe is often phrased such as, I don't care what it costs, but make sure you're giving me the top shelf, the best stuff. He always wants the really good stuff. And of course, that mounts up over a period of time. Jefferson was an anti-whiskey president, and the people that came after him, such as Madison and Monroe, who he influenced, were also very much in that way. And he said, no nation is drunken where wine is cheap. Wine is, in truth, the only antidote to the bane of whiskey. So it was very sort of aristocratic view of drinking. And he saw the damage that whiskey could do to the average man in the street. And he wanted it to be a more refined drinking, as it was in Europe, as the French had taught him, to have this wine and such. Jefferson was so into wine that there's this funny letter that he writes to Monroe after Monroe is president. They were good friends. And he sends him a 5-page letter. The first paragraph says something like, congratulations on being elected president. You're going to be a great president, that kind of thing. Now let's not dwell on that any longer. And then the next 4.5 pages are all about what wines he's ordering and why Monroe should also order them. And it's like, hey, you're president, let's get down to ordering some more wine. March 15th is Andrew Jackson's birthday coming up. This is Jackson after the inauguration in 29. And the masses were invited to the inauguration party at the White House, and they burst in there. And he almost had to have a protective scrum around him. They were so, imagine a very large St. Bernard with muddy paws. This is basically what the crowd was like. They came in, mud on their boots. They stood on tables. They broke crockery. They were all inebriated, intoxicated. The upper crust of Washington was appalled. They called them King Mob, rabble, that kind of thing. But Jackson was in many ways the man who was first said to be the president of the people. So at least initially, he didn't mind having these guys in the White House. The only way they finally got them outside again was they carried these big buckets of orange whiskey punch out onto the White House lawn, and then they all went back outside. And according to one account, Jackson actually had to crawl out a back window to get out of there. And he did, and then spent the night over in Alexandria at Gatsby's Tavern. Jackson's letters, like Washington's, are very fun to go through when you find alcohol references. And here's one. A guy made him a really nice handmade pair of pistols. As we know, Jackson loved to fight duels and things like that. He was the only president to have killed a man in a duel. And by the time he's president, he still has a bullet or two in his body from some of these misadventures. But this was a thank you note to a man that made him pistols. He said, "Dear sir, this morning your pistols was handed to me, together with your letter for which I thank you. The whiskey you can have at any time in such quantities as you may think proper or as you may require." And like Washington, Jackson had his own whiskey manufacturing at the Hermitage in Tennessee and also at another property. So he basically was telling Captain Robert Hayes, hey, come by, take as much as you want or need. And that was pretty common in his day to use whiskey almost as a currency. So not only did he make it and sell it, but he also used it for bartering. So when you go through his notes and such, you'll see that he's often trading whiskey for this and that. This is John Adams, second president. And this guy was an incredible drinker. And I mean that in a good way, in that he didn't really show that he was inebriated very often. And he could drink enormous amounts of alcohol and not show it. So he is one of the guys that I put in the heavyweight category for presidential drinking. And he also used tobacco from like the age of 10 or something. And imagine, I think he lived to be 91, which is pretty incredible considering he often had hard cider in the morning for his breakfast drink, you know. It's not just orange juice for these guys. So when he was down in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, this was one of his entries. And it's pretty common that he would write this, or sometimes in a letter back to his wife Abigail, he'd mention where he was drinking and what he was drinking. And dined with Mr. Benjamin Chew, wines most excellent and admirable. I drank Madeira at a great rate and found no inconvenience in it. Now, what he means by no inconvenience, these Revolution-era fellows, they didn't say hangover, but when they said I felt no inconvenience, they meant they didn't have a hangover. If they did the next day, if they wrote, I had great inconvenience, then you knew. Usually the word headache would appear along with it. One of the fun things about embarking on this subject was I had to sort of learn a different language for the revolutionary presidents because they used a sort of different alcohol slang. In other words, this inconvenience instead of hangover. They would also, instead of saying he was on a bender or a 3-day binge, they would say he was on quite a frolic, which sounds so innocent, you know. Sounds like they're skipping or something, I don't know, but quite a frolic. But that was sort of their code for, wow, this guy was, you know, at the bottle for several days. So that alcohol slang was quite interesting. And often instead of saying he was drunk, they would say he was quite fuddled. You know, he was down at Ye Old Tavern and he was very fuddled. So, now this is John Quincy Adams, and he also must have picked up his father's gene for being able to handle alcohol, and he was certainly no stranger to it. He starts out at Harvard sort of not really much of an imbiber, but by the time he's a young law student, he's at it fairly heavy. And here's an entry I found in his diary, a really interesting 3 or 4 days entries in this particular diary where he does talk about overindulging. And the next few days after this quote that we'll read, he talks about how I don't think I really drank that much to feel as bad as I feel. And finally, after the third day where he admits that he can't read or write, he acknowledges that he had overindulged and says something to the effect that the punishment is always so much more severe than the deed. But here he says, we got to singing after supper, and the bottle went round with an unusual rapidity until a round dozen had disappeared. I then thought it was high time to retreat and slipped away from those of the company who appeared to be the most inspired. And JQA is often talking about these companions of his that are much more party-oriented than he is, that are occasionally dragging him into their misadventures. This is our boy Teddy Roosevelt. I should say Theodore because he didn't like the name Teddy, actually. So people asked me, do you think he would have liked your book? I said, I think he may have enjoyed the book, but he would not have liked the title. I would have had to change that to Theodore. He was a very moderate drinker, unlike his relation FDR later, who was fairly heavy. But Teddy was sort of moderate in his drinking, partly because members of his family had rather severe issues with alcohol. But people assumed that he drank more than he did, especially some of his enemies. The title for my book, Why Did I Settle on That?, was one of the things that he did enjoy was an occasional mint julep. And usually he liked to have his mint juleps when he had tennis matches. He was a big tennis enthusiast. They had a nice court at the White House. Right near the court, they had a fine bed of fresh mint. Teddy, when he got into something, did it full blast. So he would want to play tennis even if it was raining. And the younger guys in his cabinet or men in his cabinet would be like, oh, Roosevelt wants to play tennis again, that kind of thing. So he used these mint juleps as an enticement. And after 2 or 3 sets of tennis, he would reward these players with a mint julep. He'd have his steward, a guy by the name of Pinckney, mix them up. And then he would come out, hand them to someone. They'd say, thank you, Mr. President. He'd say, delighted, or something like that. And you may recall that his cabinet then became known as the tennis cabinet. There was a fine bed of mint at the White House. I may have drunk a half dozen mint juleps in a year. Roosevelt had to actually give that testimony out in Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, this remote town in Michigan, because an editor up there had written in his editorial that Roosevelt was a heavy drinker and a man who sweared, that kind of thing. And Roosevelt was sick of these attacks on his character. So to make a point, he went all the way to Michigan. He hired a great lawyer out of Chicago, I believe, and went out, won the case quite easily. Could have really sued the man for enough to have put him under. He settled for 6 cents. And when he walked out of the court, the reporters all gathered around and said, Mr. Roosevelt, Colonel Roosevelt, you know, why only 6 cents? And he said, because that's just the price enough for a good newspaper. The guy who'd sued him, his paper sold for 3 cents. So he used it to make a point, and after that, some of these nuisance attacks on his character stopped. Now, here's Teddy's relative, FDR. Now, here is a guy who really could drink and did so right through his Harvard days on. He liked rum swizzles. He liked champagne. He liked cocktails. We associate him with the cocktail more than anything. But surprisingly, in my research, I found he also liked beer. You wouldn't think FDR was a beer guy, but he would love to have 4 or 5 bottles of beer when he played poker, and he loved to play poker. So he would sometimes get in a poker game from 10 o'clock to 2 in the morning, and he'd certainly have the better parts of a six-pack during that time. One of my favorite stories in the book, and my 90-year-old mother found this for me, and she said, "Mark, I think you might want this for your book." And I was dubious at first, and it turned out to be one of the nice finds I felt. And it's a story of Martha Gellhorn, who was Hemingway's third wife, was often a guest at the White House. Eleanor and FDR liked her. So one day at the White House, she's coming down the stairs, and she hears giggling from the cloak closet. So she's curious. She's coming down the stairs, and she hears this commotion, and she can't resist peeking into the cloak closet. And in there is FDR with a couple people around him, and he's mixing up a batch of martinis very secretively, and in her words, giggling like a schoolboy. So there's the leader of the Western world, hiding in a cloak closet, making a batch of martinis. And here, the reason is his mother, who was a very strong matriarch, would admonish him if he had more than one in front of people. She didn't care. So he was hiding in the cloak closet from his mother. She'd say, "Franklin, you've had one already. Don't you think that's enough?" That kind of thing. So there he was, giggling like a schoolboy, pulling a fast one on his mom. We know that FDR revoked Prohibition, and we should all salute him for that. Right before his fireside chat in 1933, he turned to his dinner guests and he said, "I think this would be a good time for beer." And, of course, the entire country pretty much welcomed that decision after more than a decade of being in Prohibition. And Budweiser sent a wagon full of beer down Pennsylvania Avenue to deliver him his own case or two when he made this decision. The one thing I like about FDR is he was always a wet. And by that I mean the people that were against drinking were called the dries. And Roosevelt never tried to, for political convenience, pretend that he was anything other than a wet. And of course he drank the whole time, regardless of Prohibition. Whereupon, like Harding, for instance, who would brag to his friends that he could make a champagne cocktail as well as the guy at the Waldorf Astoria, would pose, he would court the dry vote, and then, he drank the entire time, held poker games where you could get any kind of whiskey that you wanted at the White House, that kind of thing. So he was very hypocritical about his drinking, where FDR, I would say, held the line from beginning to end that he was a wet. JFK, people often ask me, well, Kennedy was probably a big drinker, and he really wasn't. He was quite moderate in his drinking. Now, I will say this, Kennedy probably never would have been president if it wasn't for alcohol, because we know that his father, Joe Kennedy, made a vast fortune in his alcohol dealings. And you often hear that Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, and I would say that the proof of that is very scant. I wouldn't agree to that. But what he did do when he was ambassador to England, and he knew that Prohibition was going to be revoked, is that ahead of time he lined up all these contracts with the various Scotch and gins dealers in England, and he had warehouses full of the stuff ready to ship as soon as Prohibition was revoked. So he almost had a monopoly on Scotch when we went back to drinking again. And there's this great story where Truman loved bourbon. In fact, he would have 2 or 3 ounces in the morning. But journalists on a train once said, "Hey, Mr. President, would you like to sit down and have a Scotch with us?" And he said, "No, I don't think so." And they said, "Well, how about a bourbon?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll have a bourbon." So one of the journalists is curious, and he says, "Well, Mr. Truman, why would you don't like Scotch? You wouldn't have a Scotch with us?" And he said, "Every time you have a Scotch, you put another quarter in Joe Kennedy's pocket." He didn't like Joe Kennedy. And if you recall, when JFK ran for president, Truman was very slow to endorse him, even though they were both Democrats. And the journalists said to him, "What is it you don't like about Kennedy? Is it that he's a Catholic?" You know, because if you remember, that was a big controversy. And Truman said, "It's not the Pope I'm worried about, it's the Pop." He felt that Joe Kennedy would control the sun, and he didn't want Joe Kennedy to be that involved. This is from Ben Bradley, Washington Post editor, and he claims, and he hung out with JFK a lot, and I love this phrase because it's sort of a quaint 50s, 60s phrase where he refers to JFK as being tight. You know, you don't hear that much, but my parents would have maybe said that. But in his memoirs, Bradley wrote, "The champagne was flowing like the Potomac in flood, and the president himself was opening bottle after bottle in a manner that sent the foam flying over the furniture." That was probably Dom Perignon, because the Kennedys loved top-shelf champagne, so it was probably pretty good stuff. And it came about that they had an impromptu twist party at the White House. Jackie was out of town, but Jackie's sister, who was quite a socialite, was there, and she was teaching JFK and some of his staffers, his male staffers, how to do the twist. So one thing led to another, and they started opening up champagne, and they were dancing to these Chubby Checker records and stuff. And JFK started shaking up the Dom and spraying it all over the White House furniture, that kind of thing. And according to Bradley, it was one of the few times that he probably had a little too much. President Obama, our current chief executive, is a very eclectic drinker. Here he's drinking a Guinness in his ancestral pub in Ireland, where he went. And he knew enough to let the Guinness build very slowly. And afterwards, he went up and put his money on the bar and said, "Hey, the president always pays his bar tab." He also likes some top-shelf wines from California. He occasionally enjoys a late night martini or two, according to the New Yorker article that came out last year. So he drinks quite a variety of things. He's probably most famous for the White House honey ale that they have. They use the honey from Michelle Obama's beehives to make this great beer. I haven't had a chance to sample it yet, but I'm hoping to get the invite anytime. It's supposed to be a terrific beer. And this is what he said in Ireland. He went up, put his own money down. He said, "I just want you to know the president pays his bar tab." The Irish were delighted, by the way, because Obama actually went in there and, in their words, they interviewed some of the Irish people afterwards. He said, "Oh, the president killed his pint." They loved it because he knocked it down in 4 or 5 swallows, where when Reagan visited there, Reagan was not a big drinker, but he would make sure he had a Guinness and have his picture taken with the Guinness. He'd have 2 or 3 sips, but rarely finished it. This is a very grainy old picture. It's from 1866 or so. And if you look sort of in the bottom middle there, you'll see U.S. Grant in his uniform, and directly to his left is Andrew Johnson. Johnson is famous for showing up at Lincoln's second inauguration completely drunk. Could barely give his VP speech. It was supposed to be a 5-minute speech, and he got the Broadway hook after he rambled on for 20 minutes and became combative with the crowd. They said poor Lincoln, with his great height, was trying to slink down in his chair out of embarrassment. And Grant also was not a good drinker. People say to me, "Oh, Grant was a big drinker, right?" And I always have to reply after my research is that Grant was a bad drinker. He had no talent for it. And after 1 glass of whiskey, his face would be flushed. And unfortunately, he did not have good breaks. He would keep drinking. Grant could go weeks without drinking. He knew, I think, he suspected that he had a problem. If his wife was around, she would ride herd on him, and this officer by the name of Rollins, they would try to protect him from drinking too much. But Grant could prove elusive at times, and once he got on a binge, he could keep going, or a frolic, we should say. And one of the other officers, said a single glass of whiskey would show on him, his face would flush at once. another lightweight in the drinking department, and I don't mean Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a heavyweight gold medal drinker. But Richard Nixon had very low tolerance, and people around him worried about that when he went on state visits and such. I love this picture, though. Brezhnev is spilling his vodka cocktail, probably, and Nixon's laughing at him. Nixon, we know that sometimes by 2 or 3 glasses of wine would be slurring his words, and in the Watergate debacle, when the walls were crashing in at the end, he would sometimes drink and drunk dial. So if you saw the movie Sideways, where Miles, his friend, tries to prevent him from drinking and dialing, but Nixon would do it too. And he had this habit of calling from San Clemente. It would be midnight there, and he'd call his lawyer back in Washington, and of course it'd be the wee hours of the morning, and he'd say, "I don't care, get Lenny on the phone." People do ask me, did presidential drinking ever affect important events? And yes, from time to time it certainly did. And this was one during one of the Mideast crises. The British Prime Minister called the White House, needed to talk to Nixon urgently. And I think it was Snowcroft that got Kissinger on the phone and said, "Hey, the British Prime Minister needs to talk to Nixon immediately." And Kissinger said, "Could we tell them no? When I was with the president, he was loaded." And I think you can listen to this on YouTube if you search around. And one of the things that gets me about that is Snowcroft, instead of going, "What do you mean the president's loaded?" he says something to the effect of, "Oh, okay, I'll tell him to call tomorrow." In other words, it wasn't that unusual of an occurrence that maybe the president was out of commission. As I said, I didn't quite know what to do with Jimmy Carter until I thought, wait a minute, Billy Carter, who's sort of the poster child for that phrase of you can pick your friends but not your relatives. And he drank enough for Jimmy and everybody else, I think. Jimmy drank a little bit more than people thought, however, but not certainly to excess. And one of the most trying things was when he had to powwow with the Russians, because the Russians, Brezhnev in particular, would always insist that he have these vodka toasts. And Jimmy finally arranged to get a very small glass of white wine, and Brezhnev would knock down his vodka, and Jimmy would knock down his 2 ounces of Chardonnay, and then Brezhnev would tease him. And this is from Jimmy Carter's own memoir. "During supper, we offered several toasts, and he, Brezhnev, bottomed up his glass of vodka each time, teasing me when I failed to do the same." There was a British punk band called The Business that once had a song called "Drinking and Driving is So Much Fun." It's certainly not polite to speak in those terms in this era. But one of our presidents that did like to drink and drive was LBJ. Now, to be fair, he often did this on his own ranch, which was probably the size of Rhode Island. And he would often go around in his Lincoln Continental, and he would drive 85, 90 miles an hour. He would drink Cutty Sark scotch in a plastic cup. And when he wanted more, he would stop, and he would rattle the ice cubes out the window. And his poor Secret Service guys that were trailing him in another car would have to run up, refill him. And then Johnson would jet off again. If you were actually unfortunate enough to be in the car with him and say, "Mr. President, I believe you might be going a tad fast," he sometimes would take his 10-gallon hat off and put it over the speedometer. And that would solve that. Now, this isn't his Lincoln Continental. This is his other trick that he liked to do. He had an amphibious car, and he'd come barreling down a hill toward this lake on his ranch, and he'd go, "I don't have any brakes." And he knew it was an amphibious car, of course, and he wasn't always drinking when he drove this one. But then they'd crash into the water, and then the people would find out they were okay. So LBJ liked to have fun in automobiles and often liked to have a drink while he was doing it. There's supposedly an embroidered pillow on his ranch that says, "This is my ranch, and I'll do as I damn well please." And this is a little description of what it was like to be with LBJ. A cream-colored Lincoln Continental driven by the President of the United States flashed up a long Texas hill, swung into the left lane to pass two cars poking along at under 85 miles per hour, and thundered over the crest of the hill. The president charged on, a cup of pearl beer within easy sipping distance. And this came from a Time magazine article called "Mr. President, You're Fun." And LBJ was actually upset when they came out with this. I think he thought he had a mulligan or something. He invited these reporters to the ranch, and they were having fun, drinking and driving. And then they had the audacity to actually go back and write a story about it. And LBJ was always very distrustful of the press, and I'm sure this was one of the reasons why. Now there's Reagan. As I said, not a big drinker. He had in common with Clinton and Obama in that they all had fathers or stepfathers with alcohol problems. So that made them a little more leery of alcohol, I think justifiably. But one thing Reagan really did know was what I call the presidential alcohol photo op. So he would often, on special occasions, St. Patty's Day and such, be photographed with a beer, usually in an Irish bar, working class bar, that kind of thing. And as I said, he would have maybe half a glass, and that would be it. He also did like some California wines, though, being from California. And weirdly enough, Reagan, having been a Hollywood actor, did not like to do makeup. When I had to go on TV for a couple things on this book tour, I had to do makeup. I don't like to do makeup either. But I think as president, Reagan could refuse. And his aide, Michael Deaver, was distressed about this because Reagan was very pale, and he didn't want the president going on national TV looking ghostly. So what Deaver came up with was he would put a really nice glass of red wine out on the table before Reagan would be due to go on TV, and Reagan would see it and go, "Wow, you got that?" And he would drink it, bring the capillaries out in his face, and he didn't look quite as pale. So it was a really good trick. One of the things I love is Reagan has one of the best presidential toast speeches of all time. He invited his adversary, Tip O'Neill, to the White House for, I think it was Tip's 69th or 70th birthday, I forget. But he said, "Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one, I would give mine away to someone else and go to hell with you." They were drinking some very good champagne, and I think Tip had more prior to that. They said that Tip O'Neill actually got very teary-eyed about this. It was, two Irish Americans flinging blarney at each other. And but as Deaver said, it did not prevent O'Neill from going outside and then bashing Reagan's policies to reporters on the White House lawn right afterwards. So maybe it was good for the moment, but it didn't last all that long, as O'Neill would sometimes refer to Reagan as Herbert Hoover with a smile. So that's it, but I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have concerning presidents and drinking. Could we go to the microphone there? I'm under orders to make you do that. I'm sorry you're sitting way over there too. I was just asked, what about Lincoln? And Lincoln was probably one of our lightest drinkers. Occasionally had small beer, which was about 2% alcohol. They gave that to little kids back then because the water was so bad. Lincoln had a great sense of humor about alcohol, though. He would sometimes, to tease his staff, bring a glass of wine up to his lips like he was going to drink, and everybody would be like, "Lincoln, the president's going to drink." And then he'd put it down and smile. And once, too, he was touring the Union lines, and he was seasick because he came by ship up the Chesapeake and it had been very bad weather. So he arrived with a queasy stomach, and a young captain or major said to him, "Mr. President, the best thing for a bad stomach would be a glass of champagne." And Lincoln smiled at him and said, "I've seen too many men seasick ashore with that very stuff," and denied the offer.
Around 1900, the Navy banned alcohol on all its ships. Does anybody know why that was done?
Well, maybe our Navy did that, and my suspicion is the military had a very uneasy relationship with alcohol. On one hand, they wanted their soldiers to have it, especially in the Revolution, Civil War. If you go through those diaries, there's constant reference to the men wanting their gills of whiskey or rum. But they also ended up having a lot of duels between officers. These guys, especially when they weren't fighting, would have downtime. They'd drink too much, they'd gamble too much, and the next thing you know, somebody insulted somebody, and they'd have a duel, and a good officer or two would be dead. Decatur, who was killed in a duel in this very city, being a prime example of that. But interesting that you bring that up, because the British Navy continued well into the 1970s, dishing out rum rations to their sailors. It was sort of more of a tradition, I think, than originally it was more of a medicinal thing. Would it protect you from getting sick? The British, when they added a little lime to it, thought it would protect them from scurvy, that kind of thing.
It's interesting you brought up Adams because he did indeed have a son who died of alcoholism, John Adams. And Andrew Johnson brought up alcohol probably saved his life because the guy who was supposed to kill him, George Azerodt, got drunk and chickened out. So he never would have been president. My question is that Teddy Roosevelt's mother was a Southern belle from Georgia. Is that why he got into mint juleps? He probably was exposed to them when he was growing up.
That's a good question. Teddy was very proud of his Southern roots, and he definitely was introduced to any sort of the Southern hospitality when it came around to drinking, that kind of thing. And for that matter, Woodrow Wilson as well. Woodrow Wilson as a boy can remember Robert E. Lee coming through his town with the Confederate cavalry. But also interesting that you brought up the relatives of the presidents often had alcohol problems, and that's sort of a common thread that I found throughout the book, not just with Teddy Roosevelt, but with other people. Andrew Johnson's sons had very bad alcohol problems, so it was fairly common. And also what you brought up with Andrew Johnson escaping the assassination because the assassin got drunk. With Lincoln, and the irony was Lincoln did not drink, but alcohol played a huge role in his death. In that we know that John Wilkes Booth, the night before, or the night of, when he went over to kill Lincoln, was drinking whiskey in the saloon across the street to get his courage up. And Lincoln's bodyguard, by a lot of accounts, went to the same saloon to get a big tankard of ale in between acts, so he wasn't sitting outside Lincoln's booth when the assassin came up to kill the president.
I'm curious about the presidents during the Prohibition period. If you found any, this isn't really your focus, you're looking at them personally, but what their position was publicly, either by radio or written. Did they typically say no comment or kind of walk out of the room when the topic came up, since they may be involving their own interest in alcohol?
Well, the ones that towed the line, people like Coolidge and such, they were pretty open about the fact that they didn't drink, and it was more about they weren't sort of finding fault with it so much as they were saying, hey, this is the law, and I'm the president, so I need to uphold the law. Now, as we've already established, Warren Harding could have cared less. You know, he drank the whole time, and his cronies drank the whole time, and they played poker in the White House, and one time Harding had too much to drink, and he actually lost a full set of White House china. So Harding completely disobeyed it. Wilson is funny because before I did this book, I assumed Wilson must have been for Prohibition. He was president. It was on his watch. And here, when I researched the book, I found out that Wilson tried to veto Prohibition, but the Congress overrode his veto, and so he was stuck with it and pretty much didn't drink a little bit. He'd had a stroke at that time, and he found that a little Scotch whiskey, and he was of Scotch-Irish ancestry, so he felt that was okay for him to have a little bit of that. Hoover claimed that he didn't drink at all during Prohibition, but he had lots of friends in the Belgium embassy. So the rumor was that Hoover would go to the Belgium embassy, have a drink or two, and technically he wasn't on U.S. soil.
Did you find any evidence that presidents increased their drinking as sort of a stress reliever once they got in office? So in other words, did their amount of alcohol consumption perhaps go up after they got in office because they used it as a stress reducer? And also, do you think there are any presidents who today would have been classified as an alcoholic?
Well, absolutely. Let me answer the last part of that first. We're pretty sure that Franklin Pierce was an alcoholic and that poor Pierce died of cirrhosis of the liver. I would say definitely Nixon drank more under stress. And if you recall, he was also under some medication at the time. And we know that alcohol and medication is usually a really bad combination. Now, to be fair, he denied the drunk dialing charges, as did his brother, but then we'd have to ignore people like Haldeman and Ehrlichman. You would have to say that they were lying because they were the ones where that story came from. It's pretty well documented. So definitely Nixon drank more under stress, and it gave a lot of stress to the people around him because when he went to China, for instance, the Chinese would toast this really powerful liquor called Mai Tai. And it's Dan Rather described it as drinking liquid razor blades. And it's about 140 proof or something. It's incredibly strong. And Nixon, as we know, had low tolerance. So they sent memos saying under no circumstances should Nixon drink any of the Chinese toast. But he did, but he sipped a tiny bit of this stuff. But it's very powerful stuff. And then Chou En-lai, to show off to Nixon, poured some in a dish and set it on fire. And that's how volatile this stuff is. And Nixon was intrigued by this. So according to one story, he took it home and was showing off for one of his daughters and almost set the White House tablecloth on fire. So Kissinger later joked with Chou En-lai, you almost burned down the White House by showing Nixon this Mai Tai stuff. I'm not sure I answered everything you asked there, but definitely there were some presidents that I would say had big alcohol problems. And for some of them, actually, cigarettes was worse. And I would put Johnson and Eisenhower in that. Johnson had several heart attacks, as did Ike, and it's probably more attributed to their cigarette smoking, as Ike sometimes smoked 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes a day when he was commanding NATO.
It's well documented that President Taft got stuck in the White House tub. I'm curious if that was while he was under the influence or while he was sober.
Well, everybody assumes that Taft must be a big drinker. Taft was a huge guy. I mean, we know that he at times was at least 340 pounds. And Grover Cleveland's very glad of that because if it wasn't for Taft, he would have been the next biggest guy. He was nicknamed Big Steve and Uncle Jumbo. But Taft, surprisingly, was a very moderate drinker. And when he tried to lose weight, he almost stopped drinking altogether. But his aide, Archibald Butt, B-U-T-T, who later died on the Titanic, Butt loved Scotch whiskey, and Taft knew that. So when Taft would have a political meeting with somebody that was boring and he didn't really want to sit there for an hour with the governor of some state, he would make Butt go in and sit down, and he'd do it by saying, "Colonel Butt, come in and have a Scotch." And Butt would come in and sit down, and the next thing he knew, 2 hours later, he was listening to some boring rambling of a politician. So Taft wouldn't have to endure it by himself.
So my question is, what about all of these first ladies? And what did you stumble upon during your research about their drinking habits, and how might that play into another book in the future, perhaps, about these women?
It's kind of hard to accumulate enough on the first ladies, but there's still good things that I stumbled on. Actually, Taft's wife, Nellie, liked to drink beer, and it was kind of scandalous for a woman in that age to drink beer. She also played cards on Sunday, which alarmed people. But she had a stroke early on when they entered the White House, and that, again, was probably due to smoking. But her early diaries are filled with references to touring in Europe and enjoying Pilsner beer. And even though she had a stroke in the early 1900s, she lived into the 1940s. And near the end of her life, she toured Mexico, and one of the Spanish words she learned right away was the word for beer. Cerveza, I believe it is, something like that. So she had that one down. Now, Betty Ford, of course, is the poster first lady for alcohol issues, in that she obviously had a problem, was very forthcoming about the problem, started the Betty Ford Clinic. There's a great picture of Betty Ford dancing on the White House table. Allegedly sober. It was the last day of Ford's administration. But it's a great picture, famous one.
Thanks a lot for your book. It's interesting just noticing in your bio. Are you a runner?
I used to be. I'm an old runner now, but I still try to get out there. But
it's intriguing to me because you have a sense of humor, and I've been kind of working on this idea that the more active people are, there's a lot more circulation and oxygen nutrients going to the brain. So that's my theme.
There could be something to that. I know if you didn't have a sense of humor for this book, you're in big trouble.
Well, and my question is really, I'm wondering, did you notice any kind of a trend from presidents, several centuries ago to more modern, where there's like a decrease in drinking, or it's just kind of all over the map?
I would say it's a little all over the map. One of the few trends, and I alluded to it before, was that Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and that sort of what I would call, for lack of a better word, and Tyler I'd include in this as well, that aristocratic Virginia presidential person were very anti-whiskey. They recognized that whiskey could be a really bad thing for the population at large. And they really felt that wine, the way the Europeans drank it, would be the way to go. And they feared that this country would actually be undermined by the whiskey consumption. And, of course, that was the fear of the temperance movement. And once women got the vote, that all came to fruition. And that had a lot to do with it. So it was more this drunken whiskey state that they wanted to avoid. There's a great book out called Vodka Politics that deals with how the Russians have been so addicted to vodka that they really cannot get away from it. And its whole history is so intertwined with the government and the military. And that's exactly what those Virginia presidents feared, a sort of whiskey state.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Have you read the book Last Call about Prohibition?
I did use that as a resource, but I was leafing through a lot of these rather than reading them word for word, but I am familiar with the book, and it's supposed to be a great book.
Yeah, well, that theme about the actual war between the distillers and the producers of beer was a pretty interesting aspect of that book, and how they played off of each other early on. But the other thing that was kind of intriguing in that learning in that book, that with Prohibition, I mean, there were all these forces, women's suffrage, just different groups coming together. But a big force that was actually coming together with Prohibition was the movement of taxes from alcohol to income. And that was a huge game changer, because then that's actually what created the funds for this 20th century continuous war, really, because they didn't really have a standing army, and so this was allowing them to kind of have the money there to keep the military going.
Very intertwined, and of course what they discovered once the Prohibition came in, that the mafia, the gangsters soon learned that was a great income for them, so people like Al Capone and such certainly moved in on that turf when it was vacated.
Yeah.
Mark, we're out of time. We appreciate your coming down today.
Thanks very much for having me.